this is a story that begins in East Africa. It begins in 1929 in Kenya, with a group of missionaries who were interested in banning the practice. Not, I mean, particularly for the constituents, but they sort of lobbied to ban it on a wider scale, and it created a kind of conflict between some groups of chiefs and elders and missionaries, and the colonial state was trying to intervene to kind of mediate this conflict. And the colonial officials ultimately decided not to ban the practice because it was going to cause too much uproar. But the missionaries did essentially ban it for the people who attended their churches and their hospitals, and schools, I should say, in particular. So this sparked what is now known as the Kikuyu Independent Schools movement. And so a group of Kikuyu, and this is mostly in Kikuyu areas of Kenya, a group of Kikuyu folks left the missionary churches, left the missionary schools, and established independent schools and churches as a way to demonstrate their dissatisfaction with this intervention. And then it becomes this kind of thing that keeps coming back over and over again. Through the 1930s, 1940s, the colonial state occasionally entertains the idea of banning it again. And Jomo Kenyatta, who's one of these early kind of cultural nationalists, writes a book in 1938, Facing Mount Kenya, where he really defends the practice. And he's looking in detail at trying to explain the sort of context of the practice within initiation practices more generally. And but it sort of continues, and Lynn Thomas goes on to talk about later in the 1950s this group of girls who circumcised themselves as a kind of political statement against, in this moment of anti-colonial uprising, and then in the post-colonial period, it sort of just keeps coming back again as a kind of feminist interventionist issue, and by this, by the 60s and 70s, you start to see other voices kind of enter this debate. And now you have there's so many different approaches to the question, and there are so many different sort of interpretations of what this means for local communities. And it's no longer just obviously a Kenyan issue, and it's a kind of global issue, especially for in the context of refugee policies, development policies. For example, one of the ways in which which a person can claim refugee status is to say they're escaping FGM, right? So this becomes a kind of global political issue today. A lot of African NGOs have created documentaries and websites and campaigns, and many African countries have banned the practice. And so it's a different kind of politics around the issue today than it was in 1929, but some of the same arguments are still made on both sides. There are many different kind of stories about the earliest modern schools in Zanzibar. Some are missionary. The missionaries, of course, claim to have the first school, the St. Mary's School for Girls, 1873. But there are all these community schools that emerge in the first decade of the 20th century. Some of them are funded by, for example, the Aga Khan from India, so that you have this kind of South Asian development of modern education in Zanzibar, because Zanzibar is a very complex, diverse society. You also have the Comorian community, so you have a group of people who trace their descent from the Comoros Islands, which is not that far from Zanzibar, who developed their own community schools in the 1920s. And at the same time, the government, the British colonial government, starts to invest in girls' education. So 1927 is the first government school run by the colonial government, and it's developed in close collaboration with the local Arab elites. And so initially, it's actually called the Arab Girls' School, and it was for Arab girls only. But within the first year, they changed that policy and accepted girls of other ethnic identities into the schools. So, the way they got these elite men on board is to say, well, we're teaching your girls these good practices of, how to become a good wife and a mother, what respectability is. We're teaching them cooking and sewing and that sort of thing. And what ultimately happens is they intersperse that with academics, and girls become more and more interested in the academics and other subjects. And so and then of course you have this interest in expanding girls' education, but in order to expand girls' education, you need women teachers. And so now you have this kind of ad hoc system where they're training individuals to become teachers so they can they can open more schools. And ultimately this kind of leads into a professionalization of teaching. And teaching is the premier profession for women, the first sort of modern profession for women in Zanzibar beyond what had been, I mean, there were other trends of professionalization for women around, Islamic scholarship and poetry and other fields, but they weren't sort of recognized in the colonial system, right? They didn't have a lot of economic sway. But as a kind of group that created a new kind of identity, carved out a new space for women, these were the first professional women to do so. So this turns into a case, and especially in the 40s and 50s, when the teachers they start to advocate, they start to kind of lobby the colonial government to demand for bereavement pay and maternity pay and other issues, they become a kind of politicized group. And this is how they get sort of co-opted by nationalist politicians who are interested in women's advancement, right? But and women are interested in women's advancement, but they see advancement in very economic terms. So it's more about, how do we increase our access to education and open up our options for economic resources. And it wasn't just through professions, it was through informal economic activities as well. But people would tell me things like, well, it was great that I went to school because I learned about math, which helped me open my own store, and then I was able to make money selling these goods, right? So that sort of notion that economics was the driving force behind their sense of empowerment. In terms of her own kind of development, I mean, she had a very diverse experience of higher education. She went to college and graduate school in the United States, but then she also did graduate study in Germany and in Kenya. And so because she sort of moved through different systems, I think she sort of found the university as her home in terms of her kind of professional identity. But it was that movement into, once she got her PhD, and she was the first woman to get a PhD in Kenya in 1971, this became her kind of, it sort of labeled her as a trailblazer and somebody who's going to knock down barriers, and I think that shifted her. I mean, this is just me reading into her, but I think that probably shifted her kind of sense of herself as a political leader, and then of course the Greenbelt movement is a really fascinating study because it really connects her professional work in which was in veterinary anatomy and veterinary environmentalism with this other kind of environmental project, which was about people's relationship to the land, right? So I think it was a good way for her to kind of use some of the scientific work that she was invested in her earlier life and translate it into a kind of politics, local politics.